The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical hummed their constant mechanical prayer, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Margaret Walsh moved through the ICU at 6:15 in the morning, before the shift officially began, checking vitals on the 3 patients who'd made it through the night. Room for 08, stable. Room for 10, holding. Room for 12, the one who'd been bleeding into his chest cavity for 40 minutes yesterday before anyone noticed. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 months now. 8 months of being the nurse who didn't have the right diplomas, the right residency program, the right connections. 8 months of existing in the careful margins of other people's institutions, where she'd learned to make herself small enough to fit into the spaces no one was watching. Her hands moved through the morning ritual with clockwork precision. Pulse oximeter on the index finger. Blood pressure cuff around the left bicep. Temperature reading from the temporal artery. Her fingers were steady, economical, the kind of steady that came from having done these things 1,000 times before, not in simulation labs or nursing school clinicals, but in the back of a Chinook helicopter at 3,000 feet, in a forward operating base where the temperature hit 115 degrees, in a field hospital where you place central lines by the light of a red-filtered flashlight because the enemy could see white light from 8 miles away. She didn't think about those things anymore. Or she tried not to. The tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching, that was something else. Something that belonged to a different Margaret, one who lived in a different life. But the tremor stopped the moment a monitor beeped wrong. The moment a patient's breath became shallow. The moment the stakes shifted and her hands became instruments of something larger than fear. The supply closet on the 3rd floor held her small insurance policy against the world. Inside her locker, tucked behind the spare scrub she never wore, the faded unit patch sat in a zippered pouch. Tan cloth. Olive green embroidery. The insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, Charlie Company. She touched it once each shift, her fingertips tracing the stitching like it was the most important thing in the world, which it was. It was proof. Proof that she'd been real once. Proof that she'd mattered. The service medal hung inside her jacket lining, sewn there with thread so fine it was nearly invisible. She didn't take it out. She didn't look at it. But she knew it was there, the weight of it settling against her ribs like a second heartbeat, a secret kept against her skin. Dr. James Mercer arrived for morning rounds at 6:45, stepping through the automatic doors with the kind of precision that suggested he'd timed it. His white coat was starched to knife edges. His stethoscope hung at exactly the same angle it had the day before, and the day before that. He moved with the bearing of a man who'd never been uncertain about his place in the world, who'd never had to learn how to be invisible. His eye scanned the unit with a calculating assessment of someone measuring every person against an internal hierarchy. The residents fell into line. The attending physician nodded in deference. The nursing staff straightened. Everyone moved slightly faster when he appeared, like gravity had shifted. His gaze landed on Margaret and his jaw tightened. She didn't see it happen, but she felt it, the way the air pressure changed when someone decided you didn't belong. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to register her steady hands, her efficient movements, the way she pulled up labs on the computer terminal without hesitation. He watched the way she oriented the blood pressure cuff without checking the instruction card taped to the wall. He watched the way her fingers found the radial pulse on an elderly man's wrist with the kind of instinctive precision that took years to develop. What Mercer saw was a competence that didn't have the right lineage. What he didn't see was that those hands had held pressure on a femoral artery for 14 minutes while a Black Hawk spiraled through a storm to the nearest trauma center. What he didn't see was that she'd placed central lines in the dark, by feel alone, because the lights would give away their position. What he didn't see was the call sign stitched into soldiers' radios across 3 combat zones, Valkyrie 6. Morning rounds, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, capable of crushing anything that didn't move out of the way fast enough. Starting with 412. Margaret had already pulled the chart. Mr. Chen. 73. Post-operative day 1 from an esophageal resection. Surgeon's notes indicated clean anastomosis, no complications noted in recovery. Vital stable at discharge from the OR. She'd been monitoring him since he arrived on the unit at 8:30 the previous evening. She walked beside the doctor, 2 steps back, the way she'd learned to position herself. Not visible. Not invisible. Just present enough to be useful when needed. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic undertone of blood, diluted now, the body's warning system still faintly active even in rest. Mr. Chen was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of post-operative sedation, the feeding tube taped securely to his left nostril, the central line running into his right internal jugular vein wrapped in sterile gauze. Mercer approached the bed with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never made a mistake in his life. He reached for the chart at the foot of the bed, his eyes scanning the vital signs Margaret had recorded every 15 minutes through the night. Blood pressure 126/82. Heart rate 88. O2 sat 94% on room air. Stable, he said, more to himself than anyone else. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't ask if she'd noticed anything unusual. Mercer was the kind of doctor who asked questions that he'd already decided the answers to, who heard the responses he expected to hear. Margaret said nothing. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her voice, when she needed to use it, would be deferential, uncertain, exactly the right pitch to make someone like Mercer feel confident that she was merely competent at following his instructions, nothing more. Mercer finished his examination and turned to leave. He was 3 steps toward the door when Mr. Chen's monitor changed its rhythm. Not dramatically. Not an alarm. Just a subtle shift in the cadence of the beeping, the way a piece of music changes key when you're not paying attention. Margaret's head turned toward the monitor before her conscious mind had even registered what her ears had heard. Heart rate 92. 94. 96. The systolic blood pressure reading flickered downward. 124. 121. 118. Doctor, she said quietly. Mercer didn't turn around. Doctor, she repeated, louder now, moving toward the monitor. The systolic dropped again. 114. 110. The patient's face had begun to pale, his lips losing the pink undertone that suggested adequate perfusion. Mercer turned back, his expression a mixture of annoyance and the kind of dismissive patience one extended to someone who'd probably misread the numbers. The readings fluctuate. It's normal post-operative variation. 108/70, Margaret said, and now she was moving, opening the drawer that held the blood pressure cuff, positioning it over Mr. Chen's left arm, the rubber bladder fitting snugly around the bicep. The monitor hummed. Numbers appeared. 105/68. 64. And dropping. The color was leaving his face now, the way it did when the body's circulating volume couldn't maintain perfusion. Margaret's hands moved without waiting for permission. She pressed the call button on the wall. The 4-pump beeped in response. She adjusted the rate on the saline infusion, opening the line wider, letting gravity and pressure do what blood couldn't anymore. I'm calling the surgeon, she said, not a question, and reached for the phone on the wall. Mr. Chen's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, the way they did when consciousness was drowning in the dark. His breathing became shallow. His fingers twitched against the bed rail. What Mercer didn't see was that Margaret's hands had done this before. What he didn't understand was that a nurse who'd worked in the Hindu Kush didn't need permission to recognize when a patient was crashing. What he absolutely did not comprehend was that she'd learned to read the body's language before she'd ever read a hospital protocol manual, in a field hospital where the triage was simple, the ones you could save, and the ones you couldn't. The surgeon arrived 6 minutes later. A resident trailed behind. The attending anesthesiologist was already pulling up the surgical notes, the ultrasound cart rolling into position. They moved around Margaret like she was part of the infrastructure, which she was. She'd hung the 2nd liter of blood before anyone had asked. She'd positioned the patient on his left side to optimize whatever pressure was left in his chest cavity. She'd moved with the kind of automatic precision that came from having held more lives in her hands than most people would see in a lifetime. Bleeding into the mediastinum, the surgeon said, reading the ultrasound screen. Post-operative day 1 bleed. Back to the OR. Tell them we need a room in 15 minutes. Margaret was already moving, clearing the room, stepping back into the margins where she belonged. Her heart rate was elevated. Her breathing was controlled. The tremor that sometimes appeared in her hands was completely absent, burned away by the clarity that came from recognizing exactly what needed to happen next and how to make it happen. The surgeon turned to her as the patient was being transferred to the stretcher. "Good catch," he said. "Another 5 minutes and we're looking at tamponade." Margaret didn't respond. She was already cleaning the empty 4 bags, the discarded gauze, the small pieces of evidence that she'd been useful. Mercer stood in the corner of the room, his white coat still pristine, untouched by the work that had just happened, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was already rewriting the narrative in his head, the way he would have caught this too, eventually, if he'd waited just one more moment. But he wouldn't have. And they both knew it. Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from the staffing coordinator. She read it while running cold water over her hands in the sink outside the room, washing away the moment of purpose, preparing to become small again. Her hands were steady under the water. They looked like they belonged to someone ordinary. The automatic doors of Cedar Creek Medical had opened for her exactly 244 days ago, and they would remain open as long as she didn't ask for anything more than to be permitted to stay quiet in the background, doing work that would never have her name on it, belonging to a hospital that would never know what she really was. What happened next would change that calculation entirely. Mr. Chen's wife still had her hand pressed to her chest when Dr. Mercer swept into room for 12, his white coat catching the fluorescent light like a sail. Margaret had been standing there for exactly 4 minutes, watching the cardiac monitor trace its steady rhythm, the crisis contained, the blood pressure climbing back to safe numbers, when she heard his voice snap through the doorway. "Nurse Walsh. Walk me through your medication choices here. I'm concerned about your creative interpretation of standard protocols." He said it the way a priest might say someone else's prayer was heretical, his eyes moving between Margaret and the family with theatrical solemnity. The 2 daughters, one in a navy blazer and one still wearing her work badge from the dental office, both straightened. They'd been terrified 30 minutes ago. Now they were about to be terrified of something different, whether their father had just been saved or poisoned. Margaret's face remained absolutely still. Not a muscle moved. Not the jaw, not the eyes, nothing. This was the composure of someone who understood that flinching was a confession. "Dopamine at 5 micrograms per kilogram per minute, doctor. Standard vasopressor for hypertension." Her voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a textbook. Mercer looked down at the chart, his jaw working as if chewing through what to say next. He knew the dosage was correct. He had to know. But correctness wasn't the point. The point was the audience. The point was Mrs. Chen's face, watching, listening, trying to understand if she should trust the person who'd just saved her husband's life or the person in the white coat who was suggesting maybe she shouldn't. Standard for someone with your training, perhaps. Mercer's voice dropped lower, more concerned, more dangerous. He turned to the family with a sigh that contained entire narratives of worry. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know we'll be monitoring this very closely. Nurse Walsh has been with us for 8 months now, and while her initiative is commendable, sometimes initiative without proper credentials can be." He trailed off, letting the implication hang like smoke. A muscle jumped in Margaret's jaw once, a visible twitch that lasted half a second, then smoothed away. She turned back to the monitor, her hands moving to adjust the drip rate with mechanical precision, as if this conversation was happening to someone else entirely. The next day, Margaret sat in the break room with her lunch, leftover pasta in a cracked Tupperware container, the kind that had warped slightly from too many trips through the dishwasher. Nurse Jensen and 2 others from the night shift were mid-conversation about weekend plans, voices bright with the exhaustion-drunk energy of people who'd been awake too long. When Margaret pulled out a chair, it was like someone had cut a wire. The talking stopped. Not gradually. Stopped. Jensen glanced at her watch, mumbled something about remembering a dentist appointment, and left her half-eaten sandwich abandoned on the table. The other two followed within 30 seconds, one of them actually checking her phone as an excuse, the universal gesture of people fleeing. Margaret ate alone at the table for 10 minutes. Her fork moved from the container to her mouth with mechanical regularity. She chewed. She swallowed. Her hands were completely steady, the hands of someone used to doing difficult things with precision. Only when she swallowed did her throat constrict harder than it should, a small rebellion her body committed against her perfect composure. The break room air smelled like burnt coffee and something sickly sweet, someone's energy drink forgotten in the corner, slowly fermenting into a science experiment. Margaret didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. She could feel the glances, the quick head turns, the way conversation started up again only after she'd left the room, voices rushing to fill the space she'd occupied like water flowing back over a stone. In 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical, she'd learned the exact distance she needed to maintain from other people to avoid making them uncomfortable. It was approximately 5 feet. Maybe 6. Thursday morning, the unit board had a new posting under the disciplinary actions section. Margaret saw it as she was pulling on her badge, her eyes catching the hospital letterhead before she'd even processed what she was reading. The text was printed in a careful, even font, formal right UP, Margaret Walsh, RN. Failure to follow established protocols in patient care, specifically room for 12, deviation from physician orders without direct consultation, risk to patient safety through unorthodox medication administration. Each violation was referenced to a hospital regulation subsection. Mercer had done his work carefully. The kind of careful that suggested he'd been planning this, waiting for the moment to document what he'd already decided about her. The day shift gathered to read it, their voices dropping to whispers. Margaret could hear them as she pulled her hair back into a ponytail, the same way she'd pulled it back for 16 years, one motion smooth enough to do with her eyes closed. She didn't look at the board again. She didn't need to. She started her rounds as if the paper didn't exist, as if words printed on a hospital bulletin didn't have the weight of institutional power behind them. Her hands were steady as she charted, steady as she took blood pressures, steady as she drew up medications. The steadiness was the thing that cost the most. The steadiness was what she paid for. At 3:53 p.m., Margaret was in the supply closet, the place where no one was supposed to see her for exactly the amount of time it took to collect herself. The closet was narrow, lined with blue and green boxes of gauze pads and sterile gloves and compression stockings, the kind of space that felt like being inside a medical equipment factory. She pressed her palms against her eyes for exactly 3 slow breaths, the kind of breathing she'd learned in a mountain valley where the altitude was thin and the enemy was close. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. When she opened her eyes, the fluorescent light burned like it always did. Her hands were still steady. The trembling wasn't visible. It was restraint, the kind you only felt if you knew how to look for it. She returned to the floor and finished her shift. Charted her notes. Answered call lights. Checked vitals on 3 post-operative patients whose families probably didn't know that the person taking their blood pressure had probably seen more trauma in a single afternoon than they'd seen in their entire lives. The thing about being invisible was that you became very good at watching other people. You learned their habits, their fears, the exact pitch of their voice when they were lying to themselves. You learned to move through spaces without displacing the air, to exist in rooms without being remembered. The transport call came through at 7:23 p.m., crackling across the overhead speakers with the kind of urgency that made heads lift from paperwork. Incoming trauma to Trauma Bay 1. Male, mid-30s, unconscious, multiple blunt force injuries, no identification on scene. ETA for minutes. Margaret was pulling up the computer to check available beds when the dispatcher added the detail that would change everything, found near Fort Bragg property line. Military-style clothing. Possible service member. The emergency bay doors opened like a mouth and the gurney rolled through with practice speed, the transport paramedics calling out vitals with the rapid-fire precision of people who'd done this 100 times. BP 84/50 and dropping, heart rate 128, respiratory distress, severe contusions across the thorax, loss of consciousness for approximately 2 hours, unknown mechanism of injury. The patient was male, just as the report had said, with the kind of military short haircut that barely covered his scalp, and contusions that had already started darkening across his ribs like bruises painted on by someone with a very heavy hand. His jacket was torn, soaked with blood, and as Margaret moved to cut it away from his chest to access the trauma sites, her fingers caught on something sewn into the lining. A patch. Faded, almost indigo with age, with a Ranger tab visible at the top. And beside it, stitched with deliberate thread that had been maintained through deployments and washings and years that Margaret didn't want to count, a service medal that caught the overhead light. Bronze Star. No, wait. The color was different. The ribbon pattern was. She didn't finish the thought. Her hands kept moving. She established an 4-line in the right antecubital fossa with a kind of precision that came from having done it in darkness, done it in cold, done it with her hands shaking from adrenaline and still hitting the vein on the first try. She called for imaging, her voice steady as stone. Chest X-ray, trauma panel, CBC, type and cross. Diminished breath sounds on the right side, tracheal shift on palpation. Her movements were efficient, practiced, the movements of someone who understood that hesitation was a luxury that got people killed. The patient's eyes flickered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, rolling slightly. Then they locked on her face with a sharpness that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. His hand shot up with surprising strength, his fingers closing around her wrist with the grip of someone who'd spent his life gripping things that could kill him. His voice came out as a rasp, the sound of someone whose throat had been damaged, Hindu Kush. You were the medic who held the ridge. Margaret's face showed nothing. But her pulse jumped visibly in her throat, a betrayal she couldn't control. The patient's eyes tracked her face like he was reading coordinates, like he was seeing something that had been impossible until this exact moment. His grip tightened. Mortar fire. 16 hours. You did a thoracotomy with a K-bar knife. The words came out in fragments, from a memory he was pulling from somewhere deep, the kind of memory that doesn't fade because it's been welded into your bones by trauma. You're confused, Margaret said quietly. Save your strength. Her voice was the voice of a nurse speaking to a confused patient. The voice of someone who knew how to stay professional when the ground was shifting under her feet. But the Ranger, fully conscious now, even as his pressure was dropping on the monitor, wouldn't let go. He stared at her like she was the first real thing he'd seen in years. The monitor began to alarm. High-pitched, rhythmic, the sound that meant everything was about to get worse very quickly. BP 72/40. Heart rate climbing past 140. The Ranger's breath came in short gasps as his hand finally fell away from her wrist, his body tensing as the pain registered or the fear registered or something deep in his physiology understood that something was wrong. Margaret's hands moved to his chest, assessing, palpating, feeling the resistance of the ribs and the absence of normal breath sounds. Breath sounds absent on the right side, she called out. Tracheal deviation. JVD present. Tension pneumothorax. Dr. Mercer arrived in that moment, sweeping through the bay doors like he owned them, already barking orders. Get a chest X-ray. I need imaging before we do anything else. Margaret didn't argue. She prepared the medications, her hands moving through the familiar choreography, setting up what would come next. 14-gauge needle. Decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. But Mercer wanted confirmation from a machine, wanted the formal diagnosis, wanted the permission slip that would make this decision his instead of hers. The Ranger was crashing. His eyes had gone glassy, his breathing more shallow, the monitor's alarms now constant, a sound like something breaking. 3 hours from this moment, everything was going to change. 3 hours from now, Margaret Walsh was going to have to choose between staying invisible and staying silent. But right now, in this room with machines screaming and a man dying and Dr. Mercer calling for an X-ray that wouldn't arrive in time, the clock was counting down, and she had exactly 3 minutes to decide what kind of person she really was. The rain started outside the hospital windows, hammering the glass like 1,000 fingers trying to get in. The gurney burst through the ER bay doors at 2:24 p.m., wheels squeaking against polished tile like a distress signal nobody wanted to answer. The patient was a John Doe, unconscious, contusions spreading across his ribs like storm clouds, deep lacerations bleeding slow and controlled, the kind of bleeding that meant internal damage nobody could see yet. A faded unit patch was sewn inside his jacket lining, visible only because the EMTs had cut the sleeves away. Army Ranger. No identification. No name. No next of kin to call. Margaret was standing at the central workstation when the trauma alert came through, and before the attending could finish assigning beds, she was already moving. Not asked. Not volunteered. Just moved, the way a person moves toward something they're meant to do. She clipped her badge to her scrub pocket, the weight of it suddenly important, and slid into the trauma bay where the monitors were already singing their mechanical song, where the overhead lights hummed at exactly 60 Hz, where 4 sets of hands were working to stabilize someone nobody knew. "I've got vitals," she said, her voice flat and even, not a question. The resident didn't argue. She was running the left side of the bay, fingers already working through the assessment with the kind of economy of motion that comes from muscle memory older than her nursing license. Breath sounds diminished on the right. Trachea showing deviation. Chest wall rigid. The ranger's lips were starting to take on that peculiar dusky hue that meant his oxygen saturation was dropping faster than any of the monitors could keep up with. She'd seen that color before. In Helmand Province. In a field hospital without walls. The rhythm strip climbed toward tachycardia. 122. 130. His neck veins were bulging now, ropes of distended vasculature that screamed tension pneumothorax before anyone could say the words. Pressure building inside the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, shoving the heart sideways. 3 minutes, maybe 4, before complete cardiac collapse. "Get me a chest tube kit," she said. Her hands were already moving toward the supplies. "We're ordering chest imaging first," the resident said. He was young, maybe 2 years out of med school, and his voice had that particular quality of someone following the protocol book exactly because he didn't trust his own judgment yet. "Imaging won't arrive in time," Margaret said. Not arguing. Stating. The way one states that water is wet or that gravity exists. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway then, his presence entering the room like a pressure change, like someone had opened a door to somewhere colder. He took in the scene with the clinical eye of a man who'd spent 23 years building authority one careful gesture at a time. He saw the ranger. He saw the monitors. He saw Margaret reaching for a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. "Walsh, step back," he said. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "That's not your call to make." Margaret didn't pause. She didn't look at him. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, using landmarks on the ranger's chest that only someone who'd done this before in the dark, with mortar fire overhead, would know existed. Her hand moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst this world could offer. The needle went in. Clean. Decisive. Surgical. The hiss of pressurized air escaping filled the room like a breath nobody knew they were holding. The ranger's body jerked once, convulsed, then sucked in a horrible gasping breath. Then another. His color began to pink up almost immediately, the dusky cyanosis retreating from his lips like a tide going out. The heart rate dropped from 132 to 98. The oxygen saturation climbed. 78. 82. 88. 91. Stable. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Mercer's face transformed from white to a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure had just elevated into dangerous territory. "That patient could have had a hemothorax," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "You just performed emergency decompression on a trauma patient without authorization. In front of multiple witnesses. You've compromised this entire case." Margaret was already moving to the next task, securing the needle, running fluids, making the preparations for the proper chest tube that would come when imaging confirmed what her hands already knew. She didn't respond to Mercer. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She was already 3 moves ahead, the way chess players are, the way soldiers are, the way people who've held other people's lives in their hands learn to be. But Mercer wasn't finished. He was already building something. Margaret could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes were calculating, the way a predator calculates distance and wind and the precise moment to strike. He was going to build a fortress of paper. He was going to document this. He was going to weaponize it. "Get me a supervisor," he said to no one in particular. Then directly to Margaret, "You're done here. Step away from that patient." His O2 sat would have been 48 without intervention, Margaret said. Her voice was steady. Clinical. The voice of someone reporting a fact to someone who didn't understand the implications of facts. 90 seconds from cardiac arrest. "I don't care if you just performed resurrection," Mercer said. His voice had taken on that theatrical quality he used in front of families, the voice of someone performing competence rather than embodying it. "You overstepped. Way overstepped. You practiced outside your scope, and now there are going to be consequences." 2 minutes later, a supervisor was standing in the trauma bay doorway with the expression of someone who'd just been told there was a problem they didn't want to solve. Margaret was already removing her gloves, already stepping back from the patient, already becoming a ghost in her own workspace. The complaint was filed before she even made it to HR. She knew this because the supervisor told her so, walking beside her down the corridor with that apologetic expression that meant nothing, that conveyed zero actual sympathy. The complaint cited her for gross violation of scope of practice, insubordination during active treatment, and patient endangerment. Mercer had written it with the precision of a man who'd ended careers before. He knew exactly which phrases would stick, which regulations sounded official enough to survive scrutiny, which accusations would make any administrative review board nervous enough to act fast. Security arrived with her supervisor at 3:15 p.m. Not hostile. Not threatening. Just present. The way security is present when someone needs to disappear without making noise about it. "Administrative leave, pending investigation," the supervisor said. She was a woman in her 50s who'd learned long ago how to deliver bad news with the emotional effect of someone reading a grocery list. "You'll need to clear your locker. Your badge is being deactivated. You're not to contact staff or patients during the investigation period." Margaret nodded. She'd been ordered to disappear before. She knew how to do it. She'd done it in the Hindu Kush when the extraction came, when the operation was buried so deep that even her own family didn't know she'd existed in that location. She'd done it when her records were scrubbed, when her old name was sealed away, when a new identity had been handed to her like a uniform to wear into a new life. She walked to her locker. 15 minutes. That was the timeline they'd given her, though nobody had to say it out loud. She'd heard it in the supervisor's tone, in the way security positioned themselves at the exit, in the efficiency of the entire operation. Someone had trained Mercer well. Someone had taught him the choreography of institutional erasure. The locker was small. She'd kept it that way deliberately. One personal item, a framed photo of her ranger team, taken in Sanjin Valley with the Hindu Kush mountains sharp and terrible behind them. One change of scrubs for emergencies. A cardboard box that the supervisor was holding now, waiting to be filled. The cracked mug someone had left in the break room 2 weeks ago, the one that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A dying plant that had been a gift from a patient whose name she'd never learned. She placed the photo in the box first. Then the mug. Then the plant, soil spilling onto the cardboard bottom. She took her badge off and placed it on the locker shelf. The supervisor took it immediately, as if prolonging that moment might create complications. "The hospital will be in touch about the investigation timeline," the supervisor said. She meant nothing by the words. She was reading from a script she'd read to other people, probably, other people who'd broken unspoken rules, other people who'd stepped outside the boundaries someone had drawn. The rain was falling when Margaret pushed through the ER exit into the parking lot. Not gentle rain. Rain that hammered the asphalt like judgment, like punishment, like the world was angry about something and Margaret had simply been convenient to its anger. She was wearing her scrubs. She had a cardboard box. She had a dying plant and a cracked mug and a photo of people who didn't exist on any official roster anywhere. The bus stop was for blocks from the hospital. She walked there in the rain without a jacket because she'd left that in a locker too, because she'd been trained to leave nothing behind, because traveling light was a survival skill she'd learned a long time ago in a place whose name couldn't be spoken out loud. She sat at the bus stop with the cardboard box balanced on her lap, and for the first time in 8 months of working at Cedar Creek Medical, her hands weren't steady. They weren't trembling from fear. They were trembling from something colder than fear. They were trembling from the particular kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly what you could do and choosing not to do it. She pressed her palms against her eyes for 3 slow breaths. The rain kept falling. Somewhere inside Cedar Creek Medical, a man with an Army Ranger patch and a voice like gravel and recognition was waking up in a trauma bay. He was going to ask for the medic who'd saved his life. He was going to describe a woman with steady hands and eyes that had seen things that change people. And Dr. Mercer was going to make sure she was nowhere to be found when that man started asking questions. Margaret sat in the rain with her dying plant and waited for a bus to carry her away from everything she'd built in 8 months. She didn't know that the ranger was at that very moment gripping a nurse's hand, demanding to know where Captain Walsh was. She didn't know that a phone was about to ring in a secure office at Fort Bragg. She didn't know that the Army valued people who could hold ridge lines under mortar fire, and that they kept very detailed records of people like that, even when those records were supposed to be scrubbed, even when the entire operation was supposed to disappear. She only knew that her hands had stopped shaking. The rain was still falling. And somehow, the hardest part of her life had just begun again. The ranger's oxygen saturation hit 78. His lips turned blue. The cardiac monitor screamed its one-note panic as his neck veins bulged like rope twisted under strain, his chest rigid and refusing air. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of collapse that kills in minutes if you hesitate. Dr. Mercer barked orders. Get the chest tube kit. Call respiratory. We need a portable X-ray down here now. His voice carried the certainty of someone reading from a protocol. His hands stayed in his pockets. The equipment wouldn't arrive for 8, maybe 10 minutes. The ranger had 4. Margaret moved before the words finished leaving her mouth. Her hands found the crash cart. 14-gauge needle angiocath. The same needle she'd grabbed in the dark 3 years ago, in a bunker in the Hindu Kush, while mortar rounds walked across the roof and a soldier's lung was collapsing under his own body weight. Muscle memory. Her hands didn't ask permission anymore. She swabbed the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The ranger's skin was clammy, cold. His eyes were the color of fear. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure cooker releasing steam, like a sigh of relief from a body that had been drowning in its own cavity. The ranger gasped. His chest heaved once, then again. Oxygen saturation climbed. 84. 90. 93. Normal sinus rhythm returned to the monitor like a prayer answered. 20 seconds. That's all the procedure took. The same 20 seconds that used to feel like a lifetime when the ground was shaking and her only light came from muzzle flashes. Dr. Mercer's face went the color of old plums. His jaw worked soundlessly for a moment, the moment before fury finds words. You, he said quietly, are not authorized to perform that procedure. Margaret was already disposing of the needle in the sharps container. Her movements were precise, economical. No wasted motion. She didn't turn to face him. Tension pneumothorax. Patient was in cardiac arrest. Needle decompression is standard protocol in emergency medicine. You're a registered nurse. Not a physician. Not even an NP. The room had gone very still. Nurses froze at their stations. The respiratory therapist stood holding tubing that was no longer needed. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, indifferent to the hierarchy of white coats and scrubs. Margaret turned to look at him then. Her eyes were flat as slate. The patient is alive. She'd made a mistake. Not in saving the Ranger. In letting Dr. Mercer see her competence so clearly that it couldn't be spun into narrative. In performing a procedure with such clean precision that it looked less like panic and more like muscle memory. Like training. Like something she'd done before. 20 minutes later, Margaret stood in the hallway outside the trauma bay. A security guard waited a respectful distance away, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Mercer was in the administrative office, and she knew, the way you know things when you've spent your life in institutions, that he was filing paperwork. Building his case. The complaint would cite hospital policy subsections, patient safety regulations, scope of practice violations. It would be thorough. It would be lethal. Her badge was already deactivated. She could feel the weight of it in her pocket like a dead thing. "You can go," the security guard said. Not unkindly. "Just leave your credentials at the front desk." She walked past him without speaking. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and the particular industrial coffee that no one should drink but everyone did. Her scrubs were still damp from the Ranger's fluids. Her hands, when she looked at them, were steady. The trembling would come later. The rain started the moment she stepped outside. Not gentle April rain, hard rain, the kind that hammered the parking lot like applause from a crowd that didn't care if you lived or died. Margaret stood at the bus stop on Hillsborough Street, a cardboard box deteriorating in her arms because she'd left her personal belongings in the locker room and hadn't bothered with a bag. The cracked mug from her first nursing job. A succulent she'd kept forgetting to water, now more brown than green. A photograph in a plastic frame showing 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, standing in front of a bunker with mountains rising behind them like the spine of something ancient and indifferent. She knew every face. She could name them all. 3 of them were dead. 2 were still breathing. The faded unit patch was buried at the bottom of the box. Not sewn into her jacket anymore, she'd removed it years ago, sewn it into the lining of an old flight jacket she kept in a storage unit in Chapel Hill, a place no one would ever look, a place that felt like a tomb. Her service medal was still pinned inside her scrub jacket where it had been since the day a colonel in a nondescript government office told her the words that became her entire life: "You were never there. Operation Archangel is black site classified. Your records are scrubbed. You do not exist anymore. Disappear, Captain, and stay disappeared." She'd followed orders the way soldiers do. Changed her name from Margaret Kincaid to Margaret Walsh. Buried her rank so deep that only the people who'd been there would ever know it. Took a nursing job under credentials that listed none of her military training, none of her deployments, none of the 16 hours she'd spent performing emergency surgery in the dark while gunfire ate through sandbags and her for fluids ran out and she used a Ka-bar knife from her boot because they were out of surgical blades. She became a ghost by design. Ghosts don't fight back when the living try to erase them. Ghosts just disappear. The rain turned the cardboard box to mush. The cracked mug tumbled out and shattered on the sidewalk, pieces scattering across wet concrete like teeth. Water ran through the photograph, beading on the plastic, streaming across faces of soldiers she'd loved more than she'd loved her own life. Headlights blurred past. Cars carrying people who existed in systems that recognized them. Birth certificates. Social security numbers. Medical licenses. Histories that had actually happened. Margaret stood there at the bus stop with a dying plant and a photograph getting destroyed by weather, wondering if she'd been a ghost so long she'd forgotten how to be real. Her hands, those steady hands that had held lives together in the Hindu Kush and just held a ranger's life together in Raleigh, started to shake. Not fear. Restraint. The trembling of someone who'd spent 8 months learning how to disappear and had just been forced to remember what it meant to be seen. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Cedar Creek Medical. The hospital number flashed on the screen like a question she didn't want to answer. She stared at it while rain soaked through her scrubs and the photograph dissolved in her hands. Then she answered. The voice on the line was urgent, almost panicked. Ms. Walsh? This is ICU charge nurse Chen. I know what happened with Dr. Mercer. I know you're not supposed to be here, but we have a situation. There's a patient. He arrived about an hour ago, and he's refusing all treatment. He's refusing the attending. He's refusing the intensivist. He says he will only accept care from you. Margaret didn't speak. Ms. Walsh? Are you still there? I was just terminated. I know. I'm looking at the paperwork right now. But this patient, his very high profile, very specialized case, and he's specifically asking for you. Someone higher up just called and said to bring you back. Immediately. Your badge will be reactivated. Whatever happened with Mercer, that's separate. The rain hammered harder. Margaret looked at the destroyed box, the ruined photograph, the pieces of her mug scattered across concrete. She thought about becoming real again. She thought about what that cost. Give me 15 minutes, she said. And hung up. The hospital called at 6:13 a.m. Margaret was still in her apartment, cardboard box on the kitchen counter, when the voice on the phone belonged to Cedar Creek's chief of surgery, not the HR department, not security, but Dr. Patel herself, which meant the equation had shifted. A captured Taliban commander brought in for trial had refused treatment from everyone on staff. He would only accept care from one person. He'd been asking for her by a name he shouldn't have known. A name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 years. The rain had stopped. Margaret's hands had stopped shaking somewhere around midnight. She showered, dressed in clean scrubs, and drove back to Cedar Creek Medical without knowing whether she was walking into vindication or a courtroom. The waiting area outside the secure ward smelled like antiseptic and military uniforms. 2 MPs flanked the patient's door. A colonel in dress blue stood in the hallway reviewing a manila folder. When Margaret arrived, Patel was already there with security, hospital administration, and a woman in a black suit whose credentials identified her as FBI. The colonel looked up. His name tape read Clayton. His eyes moved across Margaret with the quick assessment of someone trained to catalog threats and assets in seconds. He didn't look away. You're the one he asked for, Patel said. Not a question. Margaret nodded once. He was captured 3 weeks ago. Intelligence asset. They're bringing him stateside for debriefing and trial. Patel's voice carried the weight of someone operating outside normal hospital parameters. He has a wound infection we can't treat. He's refusing antibiotics, refusing for fluids, refusing anything from our staff. His words, only the woman who pulled me from the rubble. Only her. Patel paused. Any idea what that means? Before Margaret could respond, the ranger's door opened from inside. He was still thin, his shoulder bandaged, but he was sitting up in bed instead of lying flat. His eyes found hers immediately, that same recognition, that same terrible intimacy of shared survival. He smiled. It transformed his entire face. Captain, he said. 3 words. That was all it took to change everything. The room went dead silent. The colonel's jaw tightened. The FBI agent's hand moved to her phone. Patel's expression shifted from confusion to calculation. Margaret felt each person in the hallway reassessing who she was, the way a photograph develops in darkroom chemicals and suddenly becomes clear. You know him, the FBI agent said. Not a question. Margaret kept her eyes on the ranger. We served together. The colonel stepped forward. His bearing was rigid, his uniform creased like he'd cut himself on the seams. Captain Margaret Walsh. He said it like a name being read from official documentation. I'm Colonel Graves, J.G. Corps. This patient, his name is Nazir Wahab. He was a Taliban logistics coordinator before we turned him. Intelligence has him marked as cooperative. He says you saved his life in the field. He says you treated him as human when you had every reason not to. Graves opened the manila folder. Inside was a photograph, Margaret, younger by 3 years, covered in field dust, standing in front of a canvas tent with a red crescent painted on it. That's from 2019. Camp Fortress, Cuna Province. Ring any bells? Margaret's voice came out steady. That was a long time ago, Colonel. Yes, it was. Graves paused. His face carried the weight of someone delivering news he'd rehearsed. Your field record is classified, Captain. Or was. Command released it this morning for this specific situation. The patient is refusing medical care from anyone except you. He's running a fever of 103.4, his wound shows signs of systemic infection. We need you to treat him. Hospital is waiving standard scope limitations. You have full authorization. He lowered the folder. The question is whether you're willing. Margaret moved past him without answering, walked into the patient's room, and the door closed behind her. Inside, it was just the two of them and the fluorescent hum of monitors. The ranger, Nazir, watched her with the intensity of someone who'd thought he'd never see her face again. Margaret approached the bed without hesitation. She examined his wound, which was indeed infected, the edges inflamed, the skin around it hot to the touch, pus accumulating beneath the bandage. She'd seen this before. She'd fixed this before. In the Hindu Kush, without antibiotics, without blood banks, without anything except her hands and her training. You shouldn't have asked for me, Margaret said quietly. I died in the rubble, Nazir replied in careful English. I was bleeding out. You could have left me. You could have shot me. You did neither. You saved me, then you never told anyone who you were. He paused, breath laboured. I owed you my life then. I owe you it now. Margaret started and pushed broad-spectrum antibiotics, set up a wound irrigation protocol. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire. Muscle memory took over. 3 years of pretending to be less than she was fell away like old skin. Within 20 minutes, Nazir's fever had stabilized. Within an hour, his breathing had eased. She redressed his wound with clean technique and stepped back. When she opened the door, the entire hallway had transformed. The colonel was still there. The FBI agent. Patel. And now, standing in dress blues that made the air seem to compress, a 2-star general with 4 rows of ribbons and a bearing that made everyone stand slightly straighter. General Mitchell. His face was weathered like old oak, his eyes the color of slate, and he was looking at Margaret with the recognition of someone who'd read files with redacted margins and finally met the person behind the gaps. Colonel Graves tells me you were Valkyrie 6, Mitchell said. Not asking. Margaret's voice dropped an octave. I was. The citation in your file mentions holding a field hospital alone for 16 hours during Operation Mountain Shadow. Mitchell's eyes never left hers. Do you remember that? Margaret thought of blood on her hands. Body she couldn't save. One boy who couldn't have been more than 16, shrapnel in his chest, her hands pressing against wounds she knew were fatal. She thought of the American soldiers she'd kept alive, the Afghan civilian medics who'd assisted, the Taliban fighters she'd treated because wounds didn't care about allegiances. She thought of Nazir, half dead, bleeding into sand, her voice in his ear saying, "Stay with me." I remember, Margaret said. The general raised his right hand and rendered a salute, not a casual gesture, but a full formal salute, fist to chest, held steady. Behind him, Colonel Graves did the same. The FBI agent, after a brief hesitation, saluted. Patel blinked, then bowed her head in respect. Archangel Protocol is lifted as of 0600 this morning, General Mitchell said. Your black site extraction from the Hindu Kush is officially declassified. Your records are restored. Your rank is restored. Your security clearance is reactivated, effective immediately. He lowered his hand. The Pentagon sends its regards, Captain Walsh. You've been a ghost long enough. The silence stretched like wire. Margaret felt the weight of it, the tremendous gravity of someone being returned to existence after being erased. She thought of the cardboard box in her apartment. The dried plant. The cracked mug. The photograph of her ranger team tucked between them, faces of people who'd been told she was dead, whose files had listed her as KIA, who'd stopped looking years ago. She was real again. Dr. Mercer appeared in the hallway 47 minutes later, his face already flushed. He pushed past security, his voice rising before he even reached the patient's door. "This is a violation of hospital protocol. This is..." He stopped. He saw the general. He saw the colonel. He saw Margaret standing with her back straight and her hand steady, wearing the authority she'd been hiding like a second skin. Mitchell turned to face him slowly. When the general spoke, his voice was soft, the kind of soft that comes from knowing you don't have to raise your voice to make the room listen. "Dr. Mercer, I'm told you filed several complaints about Captain Walsh's medical decisions." Mercer straightened. He tried for his usual authority. "Yes, sir. I have concerns about scope of practice and..." "I'm sure that documentation will be very useful," Mitchell interrupted, his tone carrying the flat, dead-eyed assessment of someone who'd seen men break under pressure and survived it. "For the review board examining your judgment." Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. His eyes darted to Patel, to security, looking for allies who suddenly seemed very far away. "Captain Walsh is cleared to practice in any capacity this hospital requires," Mitchell continued. "Your investigation into her conduct is closed. Effective immediately, any further complaints will be documented as retaliation and handled accordingly." The general paused. "Do you understand, Doctor?" Mercer nodded, no words left. The investigation came back that afternoon. Because Mercer had opened the door to scrutinizing clinical decisions, the auditors walked right through it. They found altered patient records, times changed to cover slow responses, medication doses adjusted in charts to hide errors. They found 6 cases where Mercer's delays or wrong calls had led to complications, each one papered over with documentation blaming nurses or residents. The fortress of bureaucracy he'd built became his prison. By end of week, Mercer was on administrative leave. The hospital settled quietly with 3 families. The medical board suspended his license pending full review. Margaret watched it unfold from the trauma bay, where she was working, where she belonged, where her hands were steady and her mind was clear and nobody questioned her judgment anymore. The ranger recovered over the next 10 days, regaining strength with the resilience of someone young and trained for hardship. The Taliban commander, after Margaret treated a wound infection the other doctors had missed, a subtle deep tissue involvement they'd overlooked, provided information that prevented an attack on a supply convoy headed for Bagram. He told the FBI she showed mercy when mercy was not required. "I will repay that debt." Margaret's credentials were reissued under her real name. Captain Margaret Kincaid. Her rank restored in hospital records, her security clearance reactivated, her existence officially returned to the world. The staff who'd avoided her in the break room now couldn't make enough eye contact. She didn't acknowledge the change. She just did her job with the same steady hands, moving through corridors that finally knew who she was. 6 months later, Margaret was lead trauma nurse at Cedar Creek Medical, training a new cohort of residents in emergency procedures. She kept the faded unit patch in her locker still, the one sewn inside the ranger's jacket lining, the one he'd given her on the day he was discharged, saying, "You earned this more than I did." Next to it was a photograph of him standing in sunshine, healthy, whole, alive because of her. On a Tuesday morning, driving to work down Spring Forest Road, Margaret passed a medical supply van at a red light. The van was old, dented along one side. Medical equipment boxes were stacked in the back. Dr. Mercer was loading supplies, his movement slow and careful, working for a rural clinic supply company now, no longer trusted with patients. Their eyes met for a moment across the distance between cars. His face showed something between shame and resentment. Margaret looked away first, not from intimidation, but from disinterest. He wasn't worth the energy. The light turned green. She drove forward. At Cedar Creek, a young nurse, new, scared, competent but doubted, approached Margaret in the hallway. Her name was Devon. She had dark hair and terrified eyes and the bearing of someone being systematically undermined. "Can I ask you something?" Devon said. "There's this doctor who keeps questioning my judgment in front of families. He says I'm rushing things, that I'm not thinking carefully enough. But I've worked through my protocols twice. I know I'm right. How do I handle it?" Margaret considered the question. She thought of the break room, the write-up, the rain, the moment when her hand shook. She thought of the weight of being unseen, of having your competence treated as arrogance, of standing in a room full of people who believed you didn't belong. "Document everything," Margaret said quietly. "Trust your training. Don't let anyone convince you that your expertise is arrogance. And remember, the ones who have seen the worst often give the most." She paused. "You know your patient better than anyone. Trust that." Devon nodded like she understood something beyond the words. In her locker, Margaret touched the unit patch once, a ritual that had become habit. A woman who'd survived the Hindu Kush. A captain who'd held a ridge with nothing but training and will. She was real now. Fully. No longer a ghost. Captain Margaret Kincaid, callsign Valkyrie 6, saving lives in the open instead of the shadows. Her hand steady as bedrock, her name in the system, her rank acknowledged, her existence complete. She closed her locker and headed to the ICU, where a trauma was incoming and the monitors were already beeping their urgent rhythm. Cedar Creek Medical had a lead trauma nurse now who knew exactly who she was, and the hospital was stronger for it. If you've ever doubted someone who turned out to be extraordinary, or if you've ever been underestimated and had to prove yourself, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Have you ever misjudged someone only to find out they were exactly who they claimed to be? Let's talk about it.